Unifinity, never unifinity, always unifinity, forever unifinity, giant finite unifinity, huge finite unifinity, superfinite unifinity, hyperfinite unifinity, megafinite unifinity, omega prosgegram infinity, never omega prosgegram infinity, always omega prosgegram infinity, forever omega prosgegram infinity, giant finite omega prosgegram infinity, huge finite omega prosgegram infinity, superfinite omega prosgegram infinity, hyperfinite omega prosgegram infinity, megafinite omega prosgegram infinity, omega oxy affinity, never omega oxy affinity, always omega oxy affinity, forever omega oxy affinity, giant finite omega oxy affinity, huge finite omega oxy affinity, superfinite omega oxy affinity, hyperfinite omega oxy affinity, megafinite omega oxy affinity. Omega vary affinity, never omega vary affinity, always omega vary affinity, forever omega vary affinity, giant finite omega vary affinity, huge finite omega vary affinity, superfinite omega vary affinity, hyperfinite omega vary affinity, megafinite omega vary affinity. Omicron oxy affinity, never omicron oxy affinity, always omicron oxy affinity, forever omicron oxy affinity, giant finite omicron oxy affinity, huge finite omicron oxy affinity, superfinite omicron oxy affinity, hyperfinite omicron oxy affinity, megafinite omicron oxy affinity, omicron vary affinity, never omicron vary affinity, always omicron vary affinity, forever omicron vary affinity, giant finite omicron vary affinity, huge finite omicron vary affinity, superfinite omicron vary affinity, hyperfinite omicron vary affinity, megafinite omicron vary affinity. Rho-daisy affinity, never Rho-daisy affinity, always Rho-daisy affinity, forever Rho-daisy affinity, giant finite Rho-daisy affinity, huge finite Rho-daisy affinity, superfinite Rho-daisy affinity, hyperfinite Rho-daisy affinity, megafinite Rho-daisy affinity, upsilon oxy affinity, never upsilon oxy affinity, always upsilon oxy affinity, forever upsilon oxy affinity, giant finite upsilon oxy affinity, huge finite upsilon oxy affinity, superfinite upsilon oxy affinity, hyperfinite upsilon oxy affinity, megafinite upsilon oxy affinity. Upsilon vary affinity, never upsilon vary affinity, always upsilon vary affinity, forever upsilon vary affinity, giant finite upsilon vary affinity, huge finite upsilon vary affinity, superfinite upsilon vary affinity, hyperfinite upsilon vary affinity, megafinite upsilon vary affinity, upsilon macroinfinity, never upsilon macroinfinity, always upsilon macroinfinity, forever upsilon macroinfinity, giant finite upsilon macroinfinity, huge finite upsilon macroinfinity, superfinite upsilon macroinfinity, hyperfinite upsilon macroinfinity, megafinite upsilon macroinfinity, upsilon brachaffinity, never upsilon brachaffinity, always upsilon brachaffinity, forever upsilon brachaffinity, giant finite upsilon brachaffinity, huge finite upsilon brachaffinity, superfinite upsilon brachaffinity, hyperfinite upsilon brachaffinity, megafinite upsilon brachaffinity. Iota oxy affinity, never iota oxy affinity, always iota oxy affinity, forever iota oxy affinity, giant finite iota oxy affinity, huge finite iota oxy affinity, superfinite iota oxy affinity, hyperfinite iota oxy affinity, megafinite iota oxy affinity, iota vary affinity, never iota vary affinity, always iota vary affinity, forever iota vary affinity, giant finite iota vary affinity, huge finite iota vary affinity, superfinite iota vary affinity, hyperfinite iota vary affinity, megafinite iota vary affinity. Iota macroinfinity, never iota macroinfinity, always iota macroinfinity, forever iota macroinfinity, giant finite iota macroinfinity, huge finite iota macroinfinity, superfinite iota macroinfinity, hyperfinite iota macroinfinity, megafinite iota macroinfinity, iota brachaffinity, never iota brachaffinity, always iota brachaffinity, forever iota brachaffinity, giant finite iota brachaffinity, huge finite iota brachaffinity, superfinite iota brachaffinity, hyperfinite iota brachaffinity, megafinite iota brachaffinity. ETA prosgegram affinity, never ETA prosgegram affinity, always ETA prosgegram affinity, forever ETA prosgegram affinity, giant finite ETA prosgegram affinity, huge finite ETA prosgegram affinity, superfinite ETA prosgegram affinity, hyperfinite ETA prosgegram affinity, megafinite ETA prosgegram affinity. ETA oxy affinity, never ETA oxy affinity, always ETA oxy affinity, forever ETA oxy affinity, giant finite ETA oxy affinity, huge finite ETA oxy affinity, superfinite ETA oxy affinity, hyperfinite ETA oxy affinity, megafinite ETA oxy affinity, ETA vary affinity, never ETA vary affinity, always ETA vary affinity, forever ETA vary affinity, giant finite ETA vary affinity, huge finite ETA vary affinity, superfinite ETA vary affinity, hyperfinite ETA vary affinity, megafinite ETA vary affinity, epsilon oxy affinity, never epsilon oxy affinity. Always epsilon oxy affinity, forever epsilon oxy affinity, giant finite epsilon oxy affinity, huge finite epsilon oxy affinity, superfinite epsilon oxy affinity, hyperfinite epsilon oxy affinity, megafinite epsilon oxy affinity, epsilon vary affinity, never epsilon vary affinity, always epsilon vary affinity, forever epsilon vary affinity, giant finite epsilon vary affinity, huge finite epsilon vary affinity, superfinite epsilon vary affinity, hyperfinite epsilon vary affinity, megafinite epsilon vary affinity. Alpha prostigrammen affinity, never alpha prostigrammen affinity, always alpha prostigrammen affinity, forever alpha prostigrammen affinity, giant finite alpha prostigrammen affinity, huge finite alpha prostigrammen affinity, superfinite alpha prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite alpha prostigrammen affinity, megafinite alpha prostigrammen affinity. Alpha oxy affinity, never alpha oxy affinity, always alpha oxy affinity, forever alpha oxy affinity, giant finite alpha oxy affinity, huge finite alpha oxy affinity, superfinite alpha oxy affinity, hyperfinite alpha oxy affinity, megafinite alpha oxy affinity, alpha vary affinity, never alpha vary affinity, always alpha vary affinity, forever alpha vary affinity, giant finite alpha vary affinity, huge finite alpha vary affinity, superfinite alpha vary affinity, hyperfinite alpha vary affinity, megafinite alpha vary affinity, alpha macroinfinity, never alpha macroinfinity, always alpha macroinfinity, forever alpha macroinfinity, giant finite alpha macroinfinity, huge finite alpha macroinfinity, superfinite alpha macroinfinity, hyperfinite alpha macroinfinity, megafinite alpha macroinfinity, alpha Vrak affinity, never alpha Vrak affinity, always alpha Vrak affinity, forever alpha Vrak affinity, giant finite alpha Vrak affinity, huge finite alpha Vrak affinity, superfinite alpha Vrak affinity, hyperfinite alpha Vrak affinity, megafinite alpha Vrak affinity. Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Deja Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity. Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Scili Perispomeny Prostigrammen affinity, Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Dejo Xi Prostigrammen affinity. Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Scili Xi Prostigrammen affinity, Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Deja Varia Prostigrammen affinity. Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Scili Varia Prostigrammen affinity, Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity, megafinite Omega Deja Prostigrammen affinity. Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, never Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, always Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, forever Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, giant finite Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, huge finite Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, superfinite Omega Scili Prostigrammen affinity, hyperfinite omega Psi prostigrum affinity, megafinite omega Psi prostigrum affinity. Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, never Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, always Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, never Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, always Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity. Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, never Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, always Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, never Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, always Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Psi Xia prostigrum affinity. Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, never Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, always Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Deja varia prostigrum affinity. Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, never Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, always Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Psi varia prostigrum affinity, Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, never Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, always Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Deja prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Deja prostigrum affinity. Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, never Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, always Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, forever Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, giant finite Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, huge finite Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, superfinite Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Eta Psi prostigrum affinity, megafinite Eta Psi prostigrum affinity. Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, never Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, always Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, forever Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, giant finite Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, huge finite Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, superfinite Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity, megafinite Alpha Deja perispomeny prostigrum affinity. Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, never Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, always Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, forever Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, giant finite Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, huge finite Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, superfinite Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, megafinite Alpha Psi perispomeny prostigrum affinity, Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, never Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, always Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, forever Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, megafinite Alpha Deja Xia prostigrum affinity, Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, never Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, always Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, forever Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, giant finite Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, huge finite Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, superfinite Alpha Psi Xia prostigrum affinity, hyperfinite alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity. Megafinite alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity. Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, never Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, always Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, forever Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, giant finite Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, huge finite Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, superfinite Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, megafinite Alpha Deja Varia prostigrum and affinity, Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, never Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, always Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, forever Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, giant finite Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, huge finite Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, superfinite Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, megafinite Alpha Psi Varia prostigrum and affinity, Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, never Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, always Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity. Forever Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, giant finite Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, huge finite Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, superfinite Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, megafinite Alpha Deja prostigrum and affinity, Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, never Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, always Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, forever Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, giant finite Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, huge finite Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, superfinite Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, hyperfinite Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity, megafinite Alpha Psi prostigrum and affinity. Omega Deja perispum and affinity, never Omega Deja perispum and affinity, always Omega Deja perispum and affinity, forever Omega Deja perispum and affinity, giant finite Omega Deja perispum and affinity, huge finite Omega Deja perispum and affinity, superfinite Omega Deja perispum and affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja perispum and affinity. Megafinite Omega Deja perispum and affinity, Omega Psi perispum and affinity, never Omega Psi perispum and affinity, always Omega Psi perispum and affinity, forever Omega Psi perispum and affinity. Giant finite Omega Psi perispum and affinity, huge finite Omega Psi perispum and affinity, superfinite Omega Psi perispum and affinity, hyperfinite Omega Psi perispum and affinity, megafinite Omega Psi perispum and affinity, Omega Deja oxy affinity, never Omega Deja oxy affinity, always Omega Deja oxy affinity. Forever Omega Deja oxy affinity, giant finite Omega Deja oxy affinity, huge finite Omega Deja oxy affinity, superfinite Omega Deja oxy affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja oxy affinity, megafinite Omega Deja oxy affinity. Omega Psi oxy affinity, never Omega Psi oxy affinity, always Omega Psi oxy affinity, forever Omega Psi oxy affinity, giant finite Omega Psi oxy affinity, huge finite Omega Psi oxy affinity, superfinite Omega Psi oxy affinity, hyperfinite Omega Psi oxy affinity, megafinite Omega Psi oxy affinity. Omega Deja Varia affinity, never Omega Deja Varia affinity, always Omega Deja Varia affinity, forever Omega Deja Varia affinity, giant finite Omega Deja Varia affinity, huge finite Omega Deja Varia affinity, superfinite Omega Deja Varia affinity, hyperfinite Omega Deja Varia affinity, megafinite Omega Deja Varia affinity, Omega Psi Varia affinity, never Omega Psi Varia affinity, always Omega Psi Varia affinity, forever Omega Psi Varia affinity, giant finite Omega Psi Varia affinity, huge finite Omega Psi Varia affinity. Superfinite Omega Psi Varia affinity, hyperfinite Omega Psi Varia affinity, megafinite Omega Psi Varia affinity, Omega Daisy affinity, never Omega Daisy affinity, always Omega Daisy affinity, forever Omega Daisy affinity, giant finite Omega Daisy affinity, huge finite Omega Daisy affinity, superfinite Omega Daisy affinity, hyperfinite Omega Daisy affinity, megafinite Omega Daisy affinity, Omega Sil affinity, never Omega Sil affinity, always Omega Sil affinity, forever Omega Sil affinity, giant finite Omega Sil affinity, huge finite Omega Sil affinity, superfinite Omega Sil affinity, hyperfinite Omega Sil affinity, megafinite Omega Sil affinity. Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, never Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, always Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, forever Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, giant finite Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, huge finite Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, superfinite Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, hyperfinite Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, megafinite Upsilon Deja progigram and affinity, Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, never Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, always Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, forever Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, giant finite Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, huge finite Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, superfinite Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, hyperfinite Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, megafinite Upsilon Varia oxy affinity, Upsilon Varia affinity, never Upsilon Varia affinity, always Upsilon Varia affinity, forever Upsilon Varia affinity, giant finite Upsilon Varia affinity, huge finite Upsilon Varia affinity, superfinite upsilon very affinity, hyperfinite upsilon very affinity, megafinite. Upsilon very affinity, upsilon daisy affinity, never upsilon daisy affinity, always upsilon daisy affinity, forever upsilon daisy affinity, giant finite upsilon daisy affinity, huge finite upsilon daisy affinity, superfinite upsilon daisy affinity, hyperfinite upsilon daisy affinity, megafinite upsilon daisy affinity. Omicron daisy oxy affinity, never Omicron daisy oxy affinity, always Omicron daisy oxy affinity, forever Omicron daisy oxy affinity, giant finite Omicron daisy oxy affinity, huge finite Omicron daisy oxy affinity, superfinite Omicron daisy oxy affinity, hyperfinite Omicron daisy oxy affinity, megafinite Omicron daisy oxy affinity, Omicron Psi oxy affinity, never Omicron Psi oxy affinity, always Omicron Psi oxy affinity, forever Omicron Psi oxy affinity, giant finite Omicron Psi oxy affinity, huge finite Omicron Psi oxy affinity, superfinite Omicron Psi oxy affinity, hyperfinite Omicron Psi oxy affinity, megafinite Omicron Psi oxy affinity, Omicron daisy very affinity, never Omicron daisy very affinity, always Omicron daisy very affinity, forever Omicron daisy very affinity, giant finite Omicron daisy very affinity, huge finite Omicron daisy very affinity, superfinite Omicron daisy very affinity, hyperfinite Omicron daisy very affinity, megafinite Omicron daisy very affinity. Omicron Psi very affinity, never Omicron Psi very affinity, always Omicron Psi very affinity, forever Omicron Psi very affinity, giant finite Omicron Psi very affinity, huge finite Omicron Psi very affinity, superfinite Omicron Psi very affinity, hyperfinite Omicron Psi very affinity, megafinite Omicron Psi very affinity, Omicron daisy affinity, never Omicron daisy affinity, always Omicron daisy affinity, forever Omicron daisy affinity, giant finite Omicron daisy affinity, huge finite Omicron daisy affinity. Superfinite Omicron daisy affinity, hyperfinite Omicron daisy affinity, megafinite Omicron daisy affinity, Omicron Sil affinity, never Omicron Sil affinity, always Omicron Sil affinity, forever Omicron Sil affinity, giant finite Omicron Sil affinity, huge finite Omicron Sil affinity, superfinite Omicron Sil affinity, hyperfinite Omicron Sil affinity, megafinite Omicron Sil affinity. Iota daisy perispaumen affinity, never iota daisy perispaumen affinity, always iota daisy perispaumen affinity, forever iota daisy perispaumen affinity, giant finite iota daisy perispaumen affinity, huge finite iota daisy perispaumen affinity, superfinite iota daisy perispaumen affinity, hyperfinite iota daisy perispaumen affinity, megafinite iota daisy perispaumen affinity, iota Psi perispaumen affinity, never iota Psi perispaumen affinity, always iota Psi perispaumen affinity, forever iota Psi perispaumen affinity, giant finite iota Psi perispaumen affinity, huge finite iota Psi perispaumen affinity, superfinite iota Psi perispaumen affinity, hyperfinite iota Psi perispaumen affinity, megafinite iota Psi perispaumen affinity. Iota daisy oxy affinity, never iota daisy oxy affinity, always iota daisy oxy affinity, forever iota daisy oxy affinity, giant finite iota daisy oxy affinity, huge finite iota daisy oxy affinity, superfinite iota daisy oxy affinity, hyperfinite iota daisy oxy affinity, megafinite iota daisy oxy affinity, iota Psi oxy affinity, never iota Psi oxy affinity, always iota Psi oxy affinity, forever iota Psi oxy affinity, giant finite iota Psi oxy affinity, huge finite iota Psi oxy affinity, superfinite iota Psi oxy affinity. Hyperfinite iota Psi oxy affinity, megafinite iota Psi oxy affinity, iota daisy very affinity, never iota daisy very affinity, always iota daisy very affinity, forever iota daisy very affinity, giant finite iota daisy very affinity, huge finite iota daisy very affinity, superfinite iota daisy very affinity, hyperfinite iota daisy very affinity, megafinite iota daisy very affinity. Iota Psi very affinity, never iota Psi very affinity, always iota Psi very affinity, forever iota Psi very affinity, giant finite iota Psi very affinity, huge finite iota Psi very affinity, superfinite iota Psi very affinity, hyperfinite iota Psi very affinity, megafinite iota Psi very affinity, iota daisy affinity, never iota daisy affinity, always iota daisy affinity, forever iota daisy affinity, giant finite iota daisy affinity, huge finite iota daisy affinity, superfinite iota daisy affinity, hyperfinite iota daisy affinity, megafinite iota daisy affinity, iota Sil affinity, never iota Sil affinity, always iota Sil affinity, forever iota Sil affinity, giant finite iota Sil affinity, huge finite iota Sil affinity, superfinite iota Sil affinity, hyperfinite iota Sil affinity, megafinite iota Sil affinity. Eta daisy perispaumen affinity, never eta daisy perispaumen affinity, always eta daisy perispaumen affinity, forever eta daisy perispaumen affinity, giant finite eta daisy perispaumen affinity, huge finite eta daisy perispaumen affinity, superfinite eta deja perispom infinity, hyperfinite eta deja perispom infinity, megafinite eta deja perispom infinity, eta sili perispom infinity, never eta sili perispom infinity, always eta sili perispom infinity, forever eta sili perispom infinity, giant finite eta sili perispom infinity, huge finite eta sili perispom infinity, superfinite eta sili perispom infinity, hyperfinite eta sili perispom infinity, megafinite eta sili perispom infinity, eta deja oxy affinity, never eta deja oxy affinity, always eta deja oxy affinity, forever eta deja oxy affinity, giant finite eta deja oxy affinity, huge finite eta deja oxy affinity, superfinite eta deja oxy affinity, hyperfinite eta deja oxy affinity, megafinite eta deja oxy affinity, eta sili oxy affinity, never eta sili oxy affinity, always eta sili oxy affinity, forever eta sili oxy affinity, giant finite eta sili oxy affinity, huge finite eta sili oxy affinity, superfinite eta sili oxy affinity, hyperfinite eta sili oxy affinity, megafinite eta sili oxy affinity, eta deja very affinity, never eta deja very affinity, always eta deja very affinity, forever eta deja very affinity, giant finite eta deja very affinity, huge finite eta deja very affinity, superfinite eta deja very affinity, hyperfinite eta deja very affinity, megafinite eta deja very affinity, eta sili very affinity, never eta sili very affinity, always eta sili very affinity, forever eta sili very affinity, giant finite eta sili very affinity, huge finite eta sili very affinity, superfinite eta sili very affinity, hyperfinite eta sili very affinity, megafinite eta sili very affinity, eta daisy affinity, never eta daisy affinity, always eta daisy affinity, forever eta daisy affinity, giant finite eta daisy affinity, huge finite eta daisy affinity, superfinite eta daisy affinity, hyperfinite eta daisy affinity, megafinite eta daisy affinity, eta sil affinity, never eta sil affinity, always eta sil affinity, forever eta sil affinity, giant finite eta sil affinity, huge finite eta sil affinity, superfinite eta sil affinity, hyperfinite eta sil affinity, megafinite eta sil affinity, epsilon deja oxy affinity, never epsilon deja oxy affinity, always epsilon deja oxy affinity, forever epsilon deja oxy affinity, giant finite epsilon deja oxy affinity, huge finite epsilon deja oxy affinity, superfinite epsilon deja oxy affinity, hyperfinite epsilon deja oxy affinity, megafinite epsilon deja oxy affinity, epsilon sili oxy affinity, never epsilon sili oxy affinity, always epsilon sili oxy affinity, forever epsilon sili oxy affinity, giant finite epsilon sili oxy affinity, huge finite epsilon sili oxy affinity, superfinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, hyperfinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, megafinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, epsilon sili oxy affinity, never epsilon sili oxy affinity, always epsilon sili oxy affinity, forever epsilon sili oxy affinity, giant finite epsilon sili oxy affinity, huge finite epsilon sili oxy affinity, superfinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, hyperfinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, megafinite epsilon sili oxy affinity, epsilon deja very affinity, never epsilon deja very affinity, always epsilon deja very affinity, forever epsilon deja very affinity, giant finite epsilon deja very affinity, huge finite epsilon deja very affinity, superfinite epsilon deja very affinity, hyperfinite epsilon deja very affinity, megafinite epsilon deja very affinity, epsilon sili very affinity, never epsilon sili very affinity, always epsilon sili very affinity, forever epsilon sili very affinity, giant finite epsilon sili very affinity, huge finite epsilon sili very affinity, superfinite epsilon sili very affinity, hyperfinite epsilon sili very affinity, megafinite epsilon sili very affinity, epsilon daisy affinity, never epsilon daisy affinity, always epsilon daisy affinity, forever epsilon daisy affinity, giant finite epsilon daisy affinity, huge finite epsilon daisy affinity, superfinite epsilon daisy affinity, hyperfinite epsilon daisy affinity, megafinite epsilon daisy affinity, epsilon sil affinity, never epsilon sil affinity, always epsilon sil affinity, forever epsilon sil affinity, giant finite epsilon sil affinity, huge finite epsilon sil affinity, superfinite epsilon sil affinity, hyperfinite epsilon sil affinity, megafinite epsilon sil affinity, alpha deja perispom affinity, never alpha deja perispom affinity, always alpha deja perispom affinity, forever alpha deja perispom affinity, giant finite alpha deja perispom affinity, huge finite alpha deja perispom affinity, superfinite alpha deja perispom affinity, hyperfinite alpha deja perispom affinity, megafinite alpha deja perispom affinity, alpha sili perispom affinity, never alpha sili perispom affinity, always alpha sili perispom affinity, forever alpha sili perispom affinity, giant finite alpha sili perispom affinity, huge finite alpha Scili perispaumen affinity, superfinite alpha Scili perispaumen affinity, hyperfinite alpha Scili perispaumen affinity, megafinite alpha Scili perispaumen affinity, alpha Deja oxy affinity, never alpha Deja oxy affinity, always alpha Deja oxy affinity, forever alpha Deja oxy affinity, giant finite alpha Deja oxy affinity, huge finite alpha Deja oxy affinity, superfinite alpha Deja oxy affinity, hyperfinite alpha Deja oxy affinity, megafinite alpha Deja oxy affinity, alpha Scili oxy affinity, never alpha Scili oxy affinity, always alpha Scili oxy affinity, forever alpha Scili oxy affinity, giant finite alpha Scili oxy affinity, huge finite alpha Scili oxy affinity, superfinite alpha Scili oxy affinity, hyperfinite alpha Scili oxy affinity, megafinite alpha Scili oxy affinity, alpha Deja vary affinity, never alpha Deja vary affinity, always alpha Deja vary affinity, forever alpha Deja vary affinity, giant finite alpha Deja vary affinity, huge finite alpha Deja vary affinity, superfinite alpha Deja vary affinity, hyperfinite alpha Deja vary affinity, megafinite alpha Deja vary affinity, alpha Scili vary affinity, never alpha Scili vary affinity, always alpha Scili vary affinity, forever alpha Scili vary affinity, giant finite alpha Scili vary affinity, huge finite alpha Scili vary affinity, superfinite alpha Scili vary affinity, hyperfinite alpha Scili vary affinity, megafinite alpha Scili vary affinity, alpha Daisy affinity, never alpha Daisy affinity, always alpha Daisy affinity, forever alpha Daisy affinity, giant finite alpha Daisy affinity, huge finite alpha Daisy affinity, superfinite alpha Daisy affinity, hyperfinite alpha Daisy affinity, megafinite alpha Daisy affinity, alpha Scil affinity, never alpha Scil affinity, always alpha Scil affinity, forever alpha Scil affinity, giant finite alpha Scil affinity, huge finite alpha Scil affinity, superfinite alpha Scil affinity, hyperfinite alpha Scil affinity, megafinite alpha Scil affinity. And now, the one and only, Psifinity.